Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Marunouchi. I'm Anthony Rowley, a former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator today. Welcome also to the latest of what we call our deep dive events, in which we ask panels of experts to take a look at topics of current interest. And obviously, COVID-19 is one of those topics, even if lately the pandemic has not been grabbing the headlines as much as it in Japan as elsewhere. Although having said that, I see Japan is back in the headlines this morning as having achieved the highest vaccination rate in the G7, among the G7 countries. Anyway, the fact that it's become more low profile is a good thing, since it reflects the quite sudden and very marked reduction in new COVID infections here in Tokyo and elsewhere in Japan. Sometimes this improvement seems almost too good to be true. Well, we're fortunate today to have two eminent physicians here with us to explain what's been going on and whether we really are past the worst now so far as the pandemic's progress is concerned. On my right is Dr. Gautam Deshpande, and on my left is Dr. Thomas Lomax. Thank you both very much for coming this morning. Dr. Deshpande will be speaking first, so let me introduce him now, and then we'll turn to Dr. Lomax. And after that, we'll take questions from the floor and online. So Dr. Deshpande is a US board-certified internal medicine physician who did undergraduate and master's training at Stanford University and holds an MD from the Pennsylvania State College of Medicine. He's been working in Japan for 12 years, caring for the foreign community as staff internist at St. Luke's International Hospital and as the post-medical advisor for the US Embassy. He was founding vice dean of the St. Luke's International University Graduate School of Public Health and is a professor of general internal medicine at Juntendo University. He's published over 80 peer-reviewed scientific articles, with recently published work on COVID vaccine efficacy in the Japanese population, and he's a fellow of the American College of Physicians. So, Dr. Deshpande, let us turn to you, please, for your presentation.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And if you don't mind, I'll take off my mask.
Yes, please do. And if you could speak close to the microphone, please.
Absolutely. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here so that everybody can see the presentation. All right. Hopefully, everybody can see that. And thank you to Mr. Ali for having us here. This is a topic, of course, that Dr. Lomax and I have been talking about weekly for the last literally year and a half. So we've been following this very closely. There's a lot to cover, so we decided to break it up into two parts. Overall, as you know, the theme is how will the COVID-19 pandemic end? And naturally, that breaks down into two parts. Part one, which I'll be talking about, is vaccines. And I'll be going into a couple of different relevant points about vaccines, why they work, how they work, and where we're going from here. All right. So, the overall question is, how did we get from September, where the Japan caseload map looked like this, to yesterday's map, which looks like this? And that is pretty astounding change in just 2 months. To look at it graphically here, we had that really terrible, Delta wave, which we just got over, where case numbers were topping 24,000 cases per day in Japan. Now down to, I think yesterday was 204 cases in the entire country, just 27 cases in Tokyo, a city of 14 million people, which comes down to an incidence rate now of 2 per 100,000 people. And in epidemiology, we have this arbitrary sort of danger number for disease, and that's 50 per 100,000. That's generally what we say is sort of, bad disease. So not only have we blown past that, under that, we're not even at 25, we're not even at 10, we're at an incidence of 2 per 100,000. So it begs the question, is this all over? And that's what we're here to talk about. Excuse me. All right, and from my point of view, the number one, number two, and number three issues for us being in this very, very, very good position is vaccines. Now, that's not to underestimate the power of cultural behaviors, masking, people being quiet in enclosed areas like trains, and all of those good other things that were going on. A population in Japan that was compliant with lots of the restrictions and mandates. But that all being said, there really is nothing stronger than the power of vaccines. And when I say vaccines, the graph here just kind of is a summary of all the big dogs in the world of vaccines over the last 1 year. When I say vaccines, what I'm really talking about are the top two, Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines. They have been such a game changer and such a quick game changer that I think we can ascribe a lot of Japan's success and the overall world burden falling for this disease on these two vaccines, with a little bit of a contribution from the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is an adenovirus vector. It's not an mRNA vaccine. So who's getting what? Just to kind of lay out the land. So in the European Union, the vast majority of folks have gotten a Pfizer vaccine, followed by the AstraZeneca vaccine, and then a smaller proportion Moderna, with the tail end being all of those other smaller vaccines. In the United States, it's much more of an even split between Pfizer and Moderna, with a little bit of Johnson & Johnson market share. And of course, as everybody knows, living here in Japan, it's really all about Pfizer. It's more than 90% Pfizer, with about 5% Moderna, and not much else above board, at least, on the scene. So why is this important? I think before we talk about the efficacy of vaccines, we have to talk about the herd immunity threshold, or the HIT. So different diseases, as everybody knows, have different levels of contagiousness, and that's the x-axis here, and different severity, that's the y-axis. And you can see kind of diseases in modern epidemiology, the infectious diseases that we know, they kind of cluster on this graph. And based on the graph, based on where a disease lies on this graph, the HIT differs. So generally, what we've known for 50 to 75 years is that diseases like whooping cough, measles, mumps, they kind of lie out on the far side of contagiousness. They have a HIT of about 90–95%. That means that about 90–95% of a community, a town, a city, a state, a country needs to be immunized, either through vaccination or natural infection, in order to confer this herd immunity or herd protection. When we look at things like polio and smallpox, the HIT falls a little bit. You can reasonably get 80–85% of people vaccinated and still have pretty good herd immunity or protection for the vulnerable. It's even lower for things like norovirus, which is a GI bug that kind of passes around kids during the wintertime. But for coughs and colds as we know them, whether it's swine flu or influenza or coronavirus 19 or the non-19 coronaviruses, that HIT sort of falls right around 60%. Some people say it's on the lower end of 60. Some people will say that it approaches 70%, but it's right around there. So let's have a look at disease in Japan and see if that is borne out. So this is a graph that I just pulled off of the Tokyo website, and it's COVID rates in Tokyo. The biggest place that I see a drop off is right around here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. So right at the beginning of September, by the end of the first week of September, we had a marked drop in infections here. And that correlates pretty well to national vaccination rates. So on that week, Japan's national vaccination rate for people getting at least one vaccine, mostly Pfizer, was 63.3%. At about that time, around 51% of people had gotten two vaccines. So, from an epidemiologist's point of view, that looks pretty convincing that the herd immunity threshold for a disease like Corona-19 is truly in the 60% range. And I'll give a little wiggle room on both sides. I'll say 55% to 70%. But it seems to have borne out here. And I think that contributed very powerfully to the drop in infections that we saw in Tokyo, that we saw in Japan overall. So, is it over? Now, I took a very common steady state slide and I just sort of flipped it so it's upside down. So it represents sort of falling cases instead of rising cases. Is it over? Well, as you can see, in all biological systems, you don't just go from high or low right to steady state. There is a period of oscillations, overshoots, undershoots. Those oscillations get smaller and smaller, and then you hit a steady state. So are we at steady state already with Corona-19 here in Tokyo or here in Japan? I think not. So let me show you. So at the end of October, this was our effective reproduction number. It was 0.69. So let's say arbitrarily, that's where, that's the slope of where that arrow is, rapidly dropping numbers of infections. Well, as of yesterday, we're now at 0.93. So we're still under 1, which means that the virus is still shrinking, but we're not shrinking as fast as we were, say, a month ago. So now our arrow is, and again, arbitrarily, kind of closer to that nadir. I think probably over the next week or two, we'll hit the nadir, which means that viruses in Tokyo, viruses in Japan are neither growing nor shrinking. And then we'll start to see a little bit of a trend upwards. And that's what we have to watch over the next 2 to 4 weeks. How much is the overshoot going to be? Is it going to be a massive overshoot that sends us into this feared winter 6th wave? Or is it just going to be a little correction? Let me tell you what I think. So this is our reproductive numbers here by prefecture. And as you can see, there's several prefectures that are over that 1 threshold where infection is either growing in clusters or just kind of creeping up slowly. But there's also a bunch, for the first time, there's a bunch of prefectures on here that aren't reporting anything either. So the two are sort of in balance. That tracks with that national reproductive number, that we're sort of starting to reach 1, where there's a balance between growing infections in some places and no infections in other places. We're almost bottomed out here in Japan. So with the high vaccination rates, like, are we over? Is this over? Are we going to just see some little perturbations and then that'll be that? Well, I think not so fast, not unless there's additional work that needs to be done that gets done here in the country. And this is what I want to bring your eye to. So that part of the graph, and this graph is also publicly available on the Tokyo Metropolitan website, the red box represents older people, basically people in 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as you can see, compared to the left side of the graph, July through, say, September, where that proportion of people who were getting sick with new COVID-19 infections was relatively small, 3%, 4%, 5%. Right around the beginning of October, we started to see that proportion growing again. Older people were getting sick again. Why? The timing works out perfectly for waning immunity. The older people, they got their shots March, April, into May. By May, we pretty much had saturation of the older folks. But then it takes about 6 months for Pfizer vaccine's immunity to actually start waning. And timing-wise, that's when we see the proportion of older people with new cases, new corona infection start to rise again. So what are we talking about in terms of immunity? Natural immunity at about 6 months, so right about here, at 6 months, natural immunity has been shown to still confer about 95% effectiveness or 95% immunity in terms of antibody and T cell response. At about the 10-month point, you're now at 50%. And that's what the older science from this study is from February 2021. And that's what it's pretty much telling us. Initial studies of COVID vaccines initially said that at 6 months, Pfizer maintains a 91% effectiveness and Moderna maintains about a 94% effectiveness. But this was sort of like initial studies, that first cohort of experimental people. We have better data now. So this is from the Lancet, and it came out about a month ago. It was 3.5 million people. So it was the size of this study was really large. And basically just distilling it down, it shows this, that at 6 months, Delta hospital admissions were reduced by 93%. So yes, the Pfizer vaccine at 6 months still has a 93% effectiveness in keeping people out of hospital. Yay! But the data isn't super clear in terms of just being infected. So not necessarily going to the hospital, but having the sniffles and feeling terrible and passing that disease on to household members. When we look at that, at 1 month, Pfizer vaccine's 93% effective, no surprise there. But at 4 months, it's only 53% effective. Mm-hmm. In terms of preventing all infections, so Delta virus, non-Delta virus, again, 47% effective at 5 months. And so the science is much more clear now in terms of Pfizer vaccine being very good for the first 5 months or so, and then falling off a bit of a cliff at 6 months. And that correlates to the older folks that we've seen here in Japan, specifically in Tokyo as well. How about for Moderna? So Moderna is a little bit more robust. This study is from the New England Journal of Medicine, and it shows that at 6 months, the placebo group is in blue here, and the people who got Moderna are in yellow here. This is the 6 month point where my cursor is. At the 6 month point, there's still a robust difference in Corona-19 infections between the placebo group and the Moderna group. So Moderna, and this is probably true for anybody who actually got Moderna and felt all those side effects, Moderna probably packs a little more of a punch, and because of that, has a little more duration of effectiveness against infection, against hospitalization, but it comes at a cost. This data is from the Ministry of Health. It's also available on the Ministry of Health's website. I pulled this off the NHK website. If we look at body aches between Pfizer on the left and Moderna on the right, it's not really that different. You get Pfizer, you get Moderna, you're going to get body aches. Fatigue, well, fatigue is different. A substantially higher proportion of people who got Moderna had pretty significant fatigue after that second dose. Headache, substantially more people who got Moderna had more headaches after that second dose. Itching, not so different between two groups. But check this out. Clinically significant fevers, and fever is probably the biggest representative symptom of this cytokine storm in the body. Vastly different between people who got Pfizer, second dose, and Moderna, second dose. So much more side effects. And the piper always gets paid. If you have a stronger medicine, if you have a more effective medicine, you're gonna pay the piper either in side effects, relatively minor side effects like these, or more serious things like pericarditis or myocarditis. So inflammation of the heart, either the heart muscle itself or the casing around that. And it's because of these more serious side effects, albeit rare, very rare, that we saw Scandinavian countries actually pull back on Moderna. Not because it's not effective, but you might think it's almost too effective for certain age groups. So Sweden suspended use for all people less than 30 years old. Myocarditis, pericarditis tends to happen in younger people. Norway is recommending Pfizer for people under 30. Finland, they said, well, myocarditis and pericarditis happen more in boys than girls and women. So they're saying, okay, we're going to suspend it for men less than 30. And Denmark, well, there was some early misreporting, and people thought that Denmark had also pulled Moderna, and it turned out it was just this ballyhoo of bad PR and misreporting. So Denmark actually didn't end up doing anything. But these are the myriad ways that we sort of choose Pfizer, Moderna, timing, who gets what booster, who gets that booster when. It's this data, and it's a collection or a slow gradual buildup of all this data that's led the Japanese government to say, hey, why don't we start rolling out boosters at 6 months instead of 8 months? That announcement came out last Friday. All right. Another question we get a lot is, can we mix boosters? There's no evidence to say that you necessarily need to avoid mixing boosters or stick with the, or you must mix boosters if you've gotten mRNA vaccines. As far as we know, Pfizer and Moderna, their mechanism of action is pretty similar. So it seems to be safe to mix those. But how about if you got a adenoviral vector, something like AstraZeneca, and now your country or your community is offering the better mRNA vaccine? Is that safe? So this study came out of the University of Oxford. It was published in July. And what they did is they just started mixing and matching people. So if you look at this square here, the Chad, that's actually people who got AstraZeneca and then 4 weeks later, AstraZeneca. And their antibody response is pretty low. It's adequate. It's adequate to fight COVID, but comparatively, it's lower than the other groups. The group to the right of it is people who got AstraZeneca and then 4 weeks later, they got Pfizer. Look at their antibody response. I mean, it's not double, it's not triple, it's not quadruple. It's more than 5 times more. Their antibody response really looks like people who got the full series of an mRNA vaccine. Okay, now the next box to the right is people who did the opposite. They got the Pfizer first, and then 4 weeks later, they got the AstraZeneca. They don't have as robust a response. So this kind of tells us that whatever your last dose was, it should be the best out there, and it should be an mRNA. Does it matter if it's a Pfizer or a Moderna? Probably not. But the last dose that an individual gets should, as much as possible, try to be the most effective thing on the market. How does the mixing dose there, how does that measure up against people who right from the get-go got an mRNA and an mRNA? Well, that's still the best thing out there. So the rightmost box here are people who got Pfizer and then Pfizer. And they still have a higher antibody response than any of the mixed groups. So the conclusion that I draw from studies like this is, really, why would anybody get a non-mRNA series? And if you did get an mRNA or a non-mRNA series, then really from now on, whether it's boosters or what have you, you really should be thinking about mRNA vaccines. All right, so now that we're gonna boost everybody in Japan, is it all over now? Now can we put the lid on it? Well, let me pump the brakes one more time. Check out this box. So this box, this red box, is the proportion of people under 20. So teens in the dark blue and children under 10 in the light blue getting sick. So that's their proportion of total new cases. And the proportion of young people getting sick now is, it's more than 20%. So as we protect older people, and as we protect the middle-aged people who have really done a fantastic job in going out and getting vaccinated, their proportion is falling, and we're seeing more infections among children. So before I say that the pandemic is over, I think we got to treat kids. Kids are a reservoir for disease. whether that disease is cold, like common colds or COVID-19, diarrheal illnesses. Children by their nature are, and especially if they're in group settings like daycare and kindergarten and schools, dirtier than adults. This is a nice study that was published last month by Yonker and her team out of MGH, that's Harvard's affiliated hospital. And they looked at 110 kids. They basically swabbed them. They did PCRs and viral loads. And then they looked at that viral load to see if there were differences by age, by severity or types of symptoms, by duration of disease. And distilling it down, what they found is that even just among 110 kids in the Boston area, overall, there were high rates of live infectious SARS-CoV-2 virus. And kids were most infectious, so they had the highest viral loads within the first 5 days of illness when they were the least symptomatic. So they're shedding virus, they're shedding live virus, and they might not have anything but a few sniffles. There was little or no correlation between viral load and severity of symptoms, and that's why these kids are a potent reservoir. What was most interesting to me in this study, though, is even among 110 children, that's not a huge number, the researchers found multiple novel variants. Novel variants are being mutated into existence all the time, even among small groups like this. And this is why, to me, it really is important to get as many people, including children, vaccinated to really stop the development of new mutants. Because the next big bad new mutant might be the one that beats the mRNA vaccine. Pediatric Pfizer vaccine, this data is available from Pfizer's website, 91% effective for kids age 5 to 11. All right, so this is my, I believe, last slide here. So where are we going in terms of Japan? So, as of at least yesterday, last night, looking through all the data that I could find, Japan is eyeing administering COVID vaccine to children age 5 to 11 in February. So that's what they're saying right now, is that in February, the kids will start. That's great. I'm glad they are. Probably, it looks like it'll be very likely that they do start children. Would it be smarter to start the kids earlier? Yeah, I think probably so. Is the priority still on reboosting older people? Absolutely, because that's your highest risk group of death. So get those people boosted first and then start the children, but do it all as quickly as possible. I think that gives us our best chance of knocking this pandemic, really squashing it into the earth. I've put up a little bit of data here, and I'm happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them. I've put up a little data here from Nomura Research about vaccine hesitancy amongst parents for vaccinating their children. And, I think, 50% of parents said they were just gonna kind of wait and see how things go with pediatric vaccines before deciding. And a good 1/3 were reluctant or did not want to vaccinate their kids. So that's, of course, gonna be a hurdle that Japan has to get over. But Tom and I remember early on, we had the same fear about adult vaccine hesitancy in this country. And we're both so pleased that not only didn't come to pass, but blew by all of our wildest dreams. So I kind of anticipate that parents will change their tune as time moves on. And that's pretty much it. Please do email me, drdeshpande@gmail.com, if you have any questions or comments. All right, and on that note, I will hand the ball over to Tom.
Well, thank you very much for a very clear presentation. Okay, let's turn to Dr. Lomax, who, by the way, during the COVID pandemic has been managing a subscription medical support service for institutions which include the Japan Council of International Schools, several embassies, and foreign companies based in Japan. Dr. Lomax is a partner at the Tokyo Medical and Surgical Clinic, which has a 70-year history here of providing care for the foreign community in Japan. He graduated from the London University Royal Free Hospital in the year 2000 and worked in surgery and emergency medicine at St George's Hospital in London for 5 years. After that, he trained in general practice and passed the membership of the Royal College of General Practitioners exam in 2008. And shortly after that, he moved to Tokyo, where he's practiced since. So, Dr. Lomax, if you would take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So we've split this talk into two parts, and I mean, rightly, the first part has been about vaccination, because I think vaccination... Sorry, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
I think vaccination really is the key to ending this pandemic. But I think, I mean, recently there's been some exciting news about therapeutics. And I think therapeutics also do have a part to play in sort of winding down the pandemic, hopefully, over the next year. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So just a sort of brief overview. First of all, I'm going to sort of go through what the therapeutic options have been, either for people who get so sick that they're in hospital and need critical care, or for people who are less unwell, we want to give them drugs that minimize their risk of hospitalization. So what are we using at the moment? And then I'm going to talk about these two new drugs that we've seen in the news quite a lot recently, molnupiravir and Paxlovid, neither of which are currently available in Japan, although we expect we'll see both of them sort of in our armory of treatments within the next few months. And then I'll have a sort of few thoughts at the end about how therapeutics will make a contribution to ending the pandemic. Okay, and a conflict of interest statement. I don't have any commercial interest in any of the therapeutic agents I'll be discussing today. Okay, so first of all, before we look at things that we can use, there have been quite a lot of sort of blind alleys, sort of false starts on therapeutics in COVID. And I'm not going to go into detail about any of these, but you know, we've all seen in the news about hydroxychloroquine has been sort of touted as a cure for COVID. It isn't. Early on last year, people were using some of the HIV drugs to try to treat COVID, and we're still seeing people talking about ivermectin. And actually, I'll touch on the reasons for ivermectin being touted as a cure for COVID, but again, it isn't. And then there have been a few other agents like convalescent plasma that initially showed some promise, but larger data showed to be ineffective. So unfortunately, quite a lot of false starts. I'm basing most of my talk on this document, which is the therapeutics guideline that's issued by the World Health Organization. And this is a living document, so it's continually updated by the WHO. What I like about this document is whenever new data becomes available, they collate it into their document and update their recommendations. Okay, so what are we using at the moment? First of all, things we're using for people who are in hospital and are really, really sick. So very early on in the pandemic, it was shown that using high doses of strong steroids, and in this case dexamethasone, did show some benefit. And I mean, that was great news because dexamethasone is an old drug. It's not under a patent or license, and as such, it's extremely cheap. I mean, you're talking about less than $1 a day to treat people with dexamethasone. So if we have 1,000 in-hospital patients who are so sick that they need ventilatory support or supplementary oxygen, and we give them dexamethasone, how does it affect their outcomes? Well, we'd reduce the number of deaths from about 160 to 126. This is sort of best current data collated from multiple studies. We'd reduce the need to ventilate in people who are on oxygen from 116 to 86 patients. So these are non-trivial improvements in outcomes. Having said that, and on the basis of all the positive news about dexamethasone, I've had a number of my patients who've caught COVID, who are not so unwell that they need hospitalization, come to me and say, well, I've heard that this drug is great. You know, I'm at home, but I'm really worried I'm going to get more sick. So can you give me some dexamethasone? And again, there's a very clear answer to that. No, it's going to harm you. So if you're a COVID patient who's convalescing at home and we give you dexamethasone, it will at best be neutral. and at worst, it will actually adversely affect your outcomes. And probably that's because dexamethasone is not without risk. I mean, it's a strong steroid. It carries known side effects, including causing gastrointestinal bleeding in some people. It can fairly sharply elevate your blood sugar. So if you're diabetic, it can send your diabetic control all over the place. It can elevate your sodium, and through that, it can cause muscular weakness. So it's not a drug to be used trivially, and it's best used in a monitored hospital environment, which is obviously where you are if you're so sick with COVID that you need ventilation. And most of the initial data for dexamethasone is based on the recovery trial, which I think was run out of Oxford. Okay, dexamethasone is not the only agent that's being used in hospital patients. So if you go to an intensive care, you'll probably see in Japan that some people are being given interleukin-6 receptor blockers. The sort of giant blue Y shape there is a sort of schematic representation of a synthetic antibody. So these are large molecules, complicated and expensive to produce, and they're not sort of readily and cheaply available in the same way as dexamethasone. But they do offer some benefits to outcomes, although actually compared to dexamethasone, rather modest. So collating all the data together, if we give 1,000 critically sick COVID patients an IL-6 receptor blocker, what will it do? Well, it will reduce deaths from 130 to 122. So that's fairly modest. We've treated 1,000 people with an expensive drug, and we've saved 8 lives. We reduce ventilation from 86 to 82, and we make no difference in terms of duration of hospital stay. So, as I said, dexamethasone offers a better benefit than that and costs less than $1 a day. These drugs are usually administered as 1 or 2 injections at the start of a hospital stay, and they cost thousands of dollars. Now, I mean, in resource-rich, wealthy countries like Japan and the US, I mean, that's a consideration, but they are available. In the developing world, where they're treating very large numbers of the COVID patients on minimally funded public health systems, cost is a significant issue. And I mean, even if you strip away the licensing and the intellectual property cost, manufacture cost of these drugs is non-trivial. I mean, you'll never get the cost down to $1 a day because they actually cost quite a lot to make. So they offer sort of some marginal benefit to hospital patients, but they're by no means a breakthrough. Okay, so moving on from things that we're giving to critically ill patients in hospital, let's look at drugs that we can give to people who've got COVID, and when we diagnose them, they don't need to be hospitalized. So perhaps they're high-risk people, they're elderly, they've got diabetes or high blood pressure or another or obesity, a risk factor for hospitalization, and we want to give them a drug that will reduce their risk of being hospitalized. Well, a couple of things are in use at the moment. Pulmicort, budesonide, which is a readily available asthma treatment, has been trialed in the UK, where it's been given to less unwell patients who are being managed in the community with at least one risk factor, either age or a comorbidity. I mean, it's been shown to reduce the duration of symptoms by about 3 days. So I think typically if you're elderly or have a comorbidity, and you're given budesonide at the onset of symptoms, you'll be sick for about 7 days instead of about 10. So there's a modest improvement there. And hospitalization, the sort of collated data on this drug shows that risk of hospitalization in this group is reduced from 8.8% to 6.8%. So there's actually still a chance that could just be a sort of random outcome, that there's a non-statistically significant benefit. And as better data is collected, we'll get a clearer answer on that. But at best, reduction in hospitalization is fairly marginal with this drug. And then the other drug that's been in the news and is currently in use in Japan are the neutralizing monoclonal antibody cocktails. So again, this is a combination of 2 antibodies that directly bind to and neutralize the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Again, these are expensive drugs. And I mean, this is referred to as the cocktail, or Regencov, I think is how it's marketed in the US. It's a combination of 2 of these antibodies. Where did that come from? Sorry, I think I unmuted myself. So again, the intention with this drug is that it's to be given to patients who have got non-severe disease that have some risk, age, or comorbidity of needing hospitalization. So at the moment, there's a system in Japan for, although there are very few COVID cases, if you fit into that category, you can be referred on to a hospital that has this drug available, and they will give it to you with the intention of reducing your risk of developing disease severe enough that you need hospitalization. So again, let's use the same 1,000 theoretical patients. So these are 1,000 people who aren't in hospital, but who are at risk of being in hospital. This is pretty effective. So we'll drop hospitalization from 42 people out of those 1,000 to about 13. So that's about a 70% reduction. So, I mean, that's definitely worthwhile. But remember that, I mean, at the height of the fifth wave, we were talking about 25,000 people across Japan contracting COVID. And I mean, let's say out of those 25,000 people, hypothetically, 5,000 of them were at risk of hospitalization. Giving 5,000 people a day this drug is a non-trivial expense. It's costly. I think in the US, it's being retailed at about $2,000 per dose. And I mean, even if we only give it to high-risk people, some people who are at low risk of hospitalization will still get more sick and end up in hospital. So cost of treatment actually is a major issue with using these antibodies, plus the fact they have to be injected and they have a certain risk of causing side effects, but definitely a step in the right direction. Okay, so that's sort of the past, as it were, with therapeutics. That's the drugs that we've used so far. Now, what's therapeutics going to look like in 2022? And I suspect that these two drugs that have been in the news very much in the last few weeks, molnupiravir and Paxlovid, are going to very much step to the fore. And I mean, the main reason from that is that, I guess if you have any kind of chemistry background, you can see they're what we call small molecules. They're not large antibodies. They're things that can be relatively simply chemically synthesized, and as such, they can be scaled up and offered at relatively low cost. Okay, so just briefly to talk about sort of exactly how they work. First of all, what is molnupiravir? So it is a ribonucleoside analog. So it's a drug that blocks viral replication. I mean, more importantly, it's a pill. So it's given orally. If you develop COVID next year and molnupiravir is available, you might be offered a 5-day course. You take it twice a day. The trial doses, the doses that we used on the drug trials, were between 200 and 800 milligrams a day. I think we've sort of settled on 400 milligrams. That's 2 capsules to be taken twice a day as being the optimal dose. And the sort of data on the effectiveness drug was reported about 6 weeks ago in the Move Out trial, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. So basically, the way that this drug works is, here's a picture of a sort of schematic representation of a virus, that's the thing at the top, entering a cell. Now, once the virus gets into the cell, it sort of unpacks and it releases this sort of red strand, which is viral genetic material, viral RNA. That viral RNA is read by a ribosome, which is the cell's own apparatus for making proteins. And a number of these proteins get generated by that process, of which the sort of key one here is this one, RDRP, which stands for RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So this therapeutic pathway is exploiting a key difference between the way that viruses reproduce their genetic material and native cells. So specifically, RNA viruses need to copy RNA to make more RNA, whereas our cells are only using DNA to make new DNA. So our cells will copy DNA to RNA, but they will never copy RNA to RNA. So in order for a virus to replicate, it needs to have its own special protein, this RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, which will copy its own genetic material. So that's a place where we can effectively target viral replication, and that's what this drug does. So let's have a look at that. In practice, these are the 4 letters that make up genetic code. And the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, this sort of blue thing here, is going to copy RNA onto more RNA using this feedstock. And what we're doing here is we're throwing in a molecule that looks like one of these genetic letters, but is subtly different. It's been sort of chemically modified. When it gets incorporated into viral genetic material, when the virus tries to copy RNA to make more RNA, this drug effectively stops that process. It kind of throws a spanner in the work. Okay, so that's a strategy that's been used in antiviral drugs for other viruses. And now it's been shown that this works against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. So that's the sort of theory behind this drug. How does it work in the real world? Well, when you look at these trials, to show a benefit, you don't really want to try the drug on people who look like this, because they're quite unlikely to get very sick with COVID. You'd rather give your drug to this gentleman who's got one obvious comorbidity. So when we're running all of these drug trials, we're selecting people who are either elderly or have one associated factor that makes them more likely to get sick. And in this case, obesity actually was the most common factor that came out. So we've given this drug to people who were diagnosed with COVID and got sick no more than 5 days before. And this is quite key. You've got to give these drugs fairly quickly after people develop symptoms for them to be effective. I mean, when these trials were run, there's a sort of mix of different COVID variants, but actually we're seeing globally that Delta is becoming the sort of #1 variant of COVID. And in this trial, most people who were treated actually had the Delta variant. Okay, so initially the trial on this drug intended to recruit a little over 15,000 patients, but actually it was shown to be significant. The drug was shown to be of benefit before they got to the 1,550 patients. So the trial was stopped because it's unethical to give people a placebo if you know the real drug works. Let's see how molnupiravir did against a placebo. By the time the trial was stopped, 385 patients had been given molnupiravir against 377 who'd had a placebo. In the molnupiravir group, 28, so about 7%, ended up being hospitalized against 53, so about 14% in the placebo group. So, and although it didn't reach statistical significance, nobody in the treatment group died against 8 people in the placebo group who did die. So as we see more data, we'll hope to see a significant benefit, not just in hospitalization, but also in death. So that was the first of these 2 drugs to show a fairly convincing benefit, although not quite as big as the cocktail of monoclonal antibodies that I talked about a few slides ago, at reducing risk of hospitalization in people diagnosed with COVID. Okay, let's move on to the second drug, which was reported more recently. So this is Paxlovid. So this is another small molecule, and it works by a slightly different mechanism. It's a protease inhibitor. Again, it's a tablet, and again, it's given as a 5-day course, and again, it's given twice a day. In this case, Paxlovid is given together with another antiviral drug called ritonavir. The benefit of adding the ritonavir in is that it makes the Paxlovid stay in your system slightly longer and thereby increases its effectiveness. And the trial data on this comes from the EPIC-HR evaluation of protease inhibition for COVID-19 in high-risk patients trial. Okay, so basically, how does this drug work? Well, we're back to this schematic representation of the RNA, the genetic material of the virus. So once this gets injected into your cell, the first step is for this genetic material, as I mentioned before for the previous drug, to be read by the host's machinery to produce this, which is a great big chain of amino acids, a protein. Now, this big chain of amino acids doesn't actually do anything and won't work. In order to activate it, the red and the blue areas, that's the PLP and the 3CL regions, need to clip this chain into lots of little pieces. Okay, so at these multiple sites, the protein chain is chopped up, and that releases individual effective components. So again, that function, clipping up this protein chain, is unique to viral replication. So it presents us with a sort of target to make an effective therapeutic agent. And that was identified as early as 2020, as early as last year. And then companies that maintain banks of different therapeutic agents went through them and looked for agents that might have some activity against this clipping up of the protein chain. And one of the drugs that was sort of flagged as being of potential benefit was ivermectin. So it was only when I was putting this presentation together that I found out about this. This is where the sort of myth that ivermectin was a treatment for COVID came from. And this got released into the sort of popular press and onto the internet. And everyone saw this and said, ivermectin works, it's going to cure COVID. Unfortunately, trials have shown that it doesn't, that while it has this chemical action, it's not effective as a therapeutic agent. So moving on to this new drug, Paxlovid, this was tried out in a trial intending to recruit 3,000 patients, but again, because it was shown to be particularly effective, the trial was stopped early. And this is the data sort of as it was presented when the trial was stopped. 607 people received the actual drug against 612 who were given placebo. Out of the 607 people who were treated, and this is again given the drug within 5 days of the onset of symptoms, only 6 were hospitalized against 41, so about 6 or 7 times more in the placebo group. So that's an even more impressive benefit than we saw with molnupiravir. And again, no deaths in the treatment group against 10 deaths in the placebo group. So this is a very promising agent. And if you just look at the initial trial data, it seems to work even better than the significantly more expensive neutralizing antibodies that we currently have available. So what's my sort of summary on the significance of these two drugs? Why are they sort of new and exciting? I mean, they really do appear to be safe and effective at reducing hospitalization in a very meaningful way. I mean, we do need more data beyond these relatively small trials that have been run by the drug companies to, first of all, confirm they're as effective as they seem to be, and also that they are completely safe. We're likely to get a lot more data on these drugs because they're going to go into first-line use quite quickly. I mean, I think everyone looking at the data will sort of say, well, the second one, Paxlovid, appears to be much better. I mean, it appears to be an 80 to 90% reduction in hospitalization against molnupiravir, which is more like 50 to 60%. The exact way that those two trials were set up wasn't the same. So unless you do a head-to-head study, I don't think it's fair to make a direct comparison. Although yes, on the initial data, Paxlovid does appear to be the slightly more promising agent. As I said at the beginning of this section, these are small molecules. These are sort of what the pharmaceutical industry may be looking at as being one of the last sort of big bucks, small molecule drugs that they produce. And they're much, much cheaper than the monoclonal antibodies that we're using at the moment. They're much easier to administer because they can be given as oral drugs, not as injections. And that means they can be scaled up. They can potentially be offered to tens of thousands of people if there's another peak of infections without needing a lot of very expensive medicine and a lot of expensive medical infrastructure. I mean, on a note of caution, I had a brief chat with one of my friends who works at World Health about what they feel about these new oral drugs. And they feel that, yes, they are exciting, they show a lot of promise, but they do require a robust and effective medical care system because they do rest on people being diagnosed early. So in Japan, it shouldn't at the moment be too difficult to get tested within 3 days of onset of symptoms. I know that testing has been a sort of sore point for a lot of people living in Japan, but it's getting easier and easier to obtain a test for COVID. In poorer countries where access to doctors and access to testing is a problem, then these drugs will be of less use. So they need a robust primary care system to function effectively. How will they help us sort of closer to the end of the pandemic? Well, I mean, I don't think for a minute that these drugs are a sort of complete solution to COVID. And I don't think that we're ever going to see the complete elimination of COVID. I mean, it does seem possible to get COVID cases down almost to zero in countries where very tight social control can be imposed. So in China, they've almost got to zero COVID. But I just think most, certainly Western democracies, and probably even Japan in the long term, will not tolerate the degree of social control that would be required to fully eliminate COVID. And as such, particularly if we're going to allow free international travel, we are going to, for the foreseeable future, need to tolerate a certain number of COVID cases. That means we're going to have to transition from a pandemic state to an endemic state. So COVID will be there. It will occur at a low level in the background, but like other diseases, other respiratory viruses that we live with, like seasonal influenza, adenoviruses, rhinoviruses, it will impose a small but tolerable burden on our healthcare systems rather than a sort of overwhelming load. Now, in order to get to that point where COVID is there, but it's endemic and it's tolerable, what do we need? Well, basically, the main thing we need is herd immunity, and that is going to be provided largely by vaccines. If we didn't have vaccinations, we'd get to herd immunity through infection, which would involve a sort of vast number of deaths. But we're now at a position where we can avoid that with an effective vaccination campaign. Beyond that, though, even with herd immunity at 70, 80%, there will still be breakthrough infections. And having some effective pharmaceutical agents that we can treat those breakthrough infections with, I think, is going to be the final piece in the puzzle. So the last 10%, I think 90% of the solution to the COVID pandemic is vaccination, and perhaps 10% is effective therapeutics. Okay?
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. And sorry, as Dr. Deshpande said, please do feel free to email me. There's my address if you have any questions, or if you would like a copy of the deck.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll take questions quickly from the room if there are. I think we have some questions online. Any questions from the room, please? Yes, Rocky, please. As usual, state your name and affiliation and which doctor you're addressing the question to. Excuse me.
Thank you. Rocky Swift with Reuters, and this is directed to either or both of you. So kind of generally, based on your practice in Japan, overseas, and your international clientele, would you give Japan a passing grade in how it's sort of prosecuted this crisis? And a bit more granular, what would you say are the things that Japan has done relatively well and the things that Japan has done relatively poorly? Again, everything is relative to the rest of the world, but, can you boil it down like that? Thank you very much.
Do you want to get that one first?
Yeah, sure. I would definitely give Japan a passing grade, and the proof is in the pudding here, with a very, very successful rollout of the vaccine, high uptake. Now, definitely gets a passing grade, but where does the credit go to? Does it go to central systems? Does it go to municipal systems? Or does it go to the Japanese public themselves? And I think that that's a harder question. And I think the Japanese public has, from the get-go, managed all of the stressors, all of the restrictions, all of the asks on mask wearing and compliance and social restrictions with aplomb, even when the vaccine was slow to roll out, and that was a frustrating time for all of us, seeing the rest of the world get vaccines months and months early, wondering when it would start here. The Japanese public was very calm about it and said, we'll get it when we get it, and then they got it. So I've been very impressed now with my retroscope about how all this has played out. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, simple answer, yes. I think they get like an A- or a B+, but they definitely get a passing grade. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember saying, I'm actually much sort of happier being in a frontline role, treating patients than having to make these really tough public health calls. So in a pandemic, you have incomplete and sometimes inaccurate information, and you need to make very quickly judgment calls about how to manage things that will sometimes you'll get wrong. And around the world, a number of governments have been roundly criticized for decisions they made, which at the time were probably reasonable, but in hindsight turned out to have caused problems. So, I mean, the UK didn't lock down quickly enough. The list goes on and on and on. Every country will come up with sort of things that they weren't happy about. For Japan, to start with the good, I think actually the way that vaccine rollout has been handled has been pretty exemplary. They started with a very vaccine hesitant population, and they've achieved the highest uptake in the world. So you have to say that's a massive success. Now, earlier in the year, there was a lot of criticism about the initial sort of slowness of the vaccination rollout. But for whatever reason, the sort of 2 to 3 month hiatus before starting vaccination, so Japan started broadly speaking, about 3 months behind the US and the UK, kind of did allow them to pick the vaccines that turned out to be the winners. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of contributed to their success. So I think kind of you'd have to say overall that was actually, whether that was sort of good fortune or good decision making, that worked out very well. Things that in hindsight could have been done better, I think the delay in rolling out testing last year wasn't great. And I think we had Dr. Shibuya talking here a few weeks ago, and he said there seemed to be sort of some conceptual problems at the health ministry. They were sort of talking about, if you do mass PCR testing, it generates false positives, which just is factually incorrect. So I think there were some, for whatever reason, delays in rolling out testing, and access to testing is still a bit of a problem now, actually. But overall, I think Japan's done a good job of managing the pandemic. And, if you look at the data, the number of cases, the number of deaths, it really does show.
Okay, yes, Kurt. Yes, please. Push the button upwards. That should do it. All right, now it is. All right.
I think I turned it off.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. I'm a high-risk person with my age, and also I'm a Pfizer May-June vaccine receiver. So, I'm just in time now for the booster. So, my first question is, how do you see the booster situation develop in Japan in the next 3 months or so? That's my first one. And secondly, we have been talking a lot about Japan doing very well recently, and I fully agree with that. Also, it started a little bit late, perhaps, at the beginning. But what do you think about the present situation, which is coming up in Europe, perhaps aside from Northern Europe, but the central part of Europe is in a terrible position right now. And how do you explain that situation? Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I'll handle the first part, that booster part, and then I'll toss the ball to Tom. So my happiest news in the last month or two was there you go. So my happiest news in the last month or two was that the government said that they're not going to overly prioritize boosters, and that they would just sort of, release booster availability to everybody roughly at the same time, starting, I believe, first week of December. Yeah. And I think that that's fantastic. It shows that there is less government hesitancy about the safety of these vaccines. It allows healthcare workers and high-risk older persons to get it virtually at the same time, which is important. And now we have that data to say how important it is. So I think that that's a great step forward, and it's emblematic, I think, of the central government sort of learning. You know, it makes mistakes. There's some slowness here and there. It needs time to sort of think and adjust, but then it generally makes the right decision, you know, on the outer end. So I'm glad the timing has worked out nicely for you.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, and then just as an afternote, they've actually now said that they'll give boosters from 6 months after the second shot. Initially, they'd said 8 months, which, looking at the immunity that you get from a Pfizer shot, there's a sort of window at the end that you're not covered for. But actually, just recently, they've said no. Individual health authorities, if they have vaccination stocks, can give the boosters to people 6 months after their second shot, which is good news. But anyway, to address your second part of your question about Europe, so we are seeing very high numbers of cases. I think Germany's reporting over 40,000 cases a day, as much as before the vaccine was rolled out, actually. So, you know, you'd look at that and say, well, the vaccine rollout doesn't appear to have done anything in Europe. That's actually not the case. And if you look in more detail, although case numbers are high, the burden on hospitals and the number of deaths is significantly lower than it was in the first half of this year. So vaccination has mitigated the number of cases, but there are still problems in Europe. And if you look at the hospitals, if you look at the people who are in hospital with COVID, I mean, unfortunately, they are by and large the unvaccinated. So I guess there's two things going on there. First of all is in some countries, uptake of the vaccine has been insufficient to achieve population immunity. And the second factor is that, you know, for better or for worse, Europe has liberalized international travel much more quickly than Japan. So I think probably, again, in the international community, we've complained bitterly about restrictions on travel, that it's hard for us to go to our home countries, that it's hard for us to have friends and family visit us. But that probably is paying a dividend in terms of keeping the case numbers in Japan very low. And I think if we fully liberalize travel very rapidly, then we probably would see a further increase in cases in Japan, as, you know, more cases were brought in and those worked their way through to the small number of unvaccinated people. So I suspect Japan will liberalize travel, but they will do so in stages and with a great deal more caution than most European countries.
Okay. Right, well, let's take a couple of questions online. The first one is from Dennis Normile of Science magazine, who asks, thank you, regarding herd immunity, I believe the Netherlands, among other countries, has about 85% of the population fully vaccinated, yet it reported over 20,000 new cases on Tuesday. So does that suggest a very high vaccination rate is needed for herd immunity? Whichever of you, Deshpande, would you like to take that, or Tom?
Well, I'll just, before giving the ball to Tom, the devil is definitely in the details. So case numbers are important, and 20,000 sounds big and scary, but really in a more meaningful way, how many of those people need ICU services, ventilatory services, how many people are getting really sick? And that's the stress and burden. And as Tom mentioned, it's a far lower burden of disease, even though those numbers are large. Tom?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I mean, Dr. Deshpande and I have been sort of compiling data on COVID and presenting it to the community, since the pandemic began. And one of the first things I learned is, okay, look at the number of cases, but you have to look at other things as well. You have to look at the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths. And I mean, high case numbers with very low mortality obviously is not an ideal situation, but it does suggest we're moving in the right direction. As Dr. Deshpande showed with his data on immunity, the vaccines are effective initially, but the first thing that happens is that people go through a sort of window period where they're very unlikely to be hospitalized but they are still relatively vulnerable to catching kind of mild disease. And I think we're seeing quite a lot of that in Europe. We're seeing breakthrough infections in people who have been vaccinated, whose immunity is sort of enough to stop them from getting terribly sick, but not enough to stop them from catching COVID. And of course, that affects transmission within the broader community.
Yeah.
Okay, well, actually, we have two more questions from Dennis Normal. So the second one is for Dr. Deshpande. Given that the virus is still in circulation, should we continue wearing masks, social distancing, and hand washing? Should mask wearing depend on the setting? That is, masking should continue indefinitely on the subway, but what about walking through non-crowded streets? Will there be a point when masking can be dropped? Dr. Deshpande first, and then Dr. Lomax, if you wish to.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that my patients are asking me virtually every day. There is, theoretically, there is a point at which the virus is at such low levels that, widespread mass strategies are no longer necessary. The question is, are we at that point right now for Japan? And I think because we're in that sort of oscillating phase towards steady state, but we haven't gotten to steady state yet, I think what I'm advising to most of my patients is, for the time being, at least the next couple of weeks to month or two, I think it's worth still wearing your mask. Happily, it's also the cultural norm right now here, so it makes it that much easier in Japan. And sensible social distancing. So if you're outside and you're naturally doing activities that allow you to be 3 to 6 feet or 1 to 2 meters apart, then do it. There's no reason to artificially force oneself into a higher risk situation versus a lower risk situation. I think we'll be more clear on whether we can drop masking in the next maybe 1 to 2 months. But right now I'm saying the better part of valor is to err on the side of caution for right now. Okay. Tom, I don't know if Tom has a different opinion on that.
Yeah, I'm certainly not telling people to drop the masks yet. The question I've been asked most frequently over the past 2 years is, why is there so much less COVID in Japan? So for the first 6 months of the pandemic, the tone of the question was, the Japanese are lying, the Japanese are concealing the COVID, the Japanese aren't testing people. There is as much COVID in Japan as in the rest of the world, you just can't see it. And that sort of petered out towards the end of 2020 when it became obvious that Japan had really sort of dodged the bullet compared to North America, South America, Indian subcontinent, Europe, pretty well anywhere else you care to look. And I think, my honest answer is there's nothing uniquely special about the Japanese people that makes them resistant to COVID. It's not because they've all been given BCG vaccines. I think widespread, rapid uptake of masks has been the most significant mitigating factor for the pandemic, up to the point at which vaccines became available. So I'm kind of hesitant to recommend we give that up. Now, there's a sort of social comfort component to mask use, isn't there? So if I was in the UK right now where people have all stopped wearing masks, I think I'd feel self-conscious and uncomfortable if I was the only person who did wear a mask. Whereas in Japan, when I go on the subway and everyone, without exception, is wearing a mask, I certainly don't want to be the only person to take my mask off. So I just don't see the sense in being the foreigner who's not wearing the mask when all the locals still are. Okay. To sort of add to Dr. Deshpande's point about medical benefit.
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman here with his hand raised. I don't recognize him. Sorry? No, I know. I have a question from Mr. Normal, but there's a gentleman here, a Japanese gentleman, who's got his hand raised, and I don't recognize him. Sorry, so if you can help me to track him down. This man here, Hanohito.
This is your class.
Oh, sorry. No. Okay. All right. So we have a third question from Dennis Normal, and he says, an academic question for Dr. Deshpande. In looking at rankings of countries with the most highly cited COVID-related papers, scientific papers, China is far and away the leader with the most highly cited papers. Then comes the US, the UK, Germany, and other European countries. And down around 9th or 10th is Japan. So why hasn't Japan made a more substantial contribution to worldwide COVID research?
I love that question. I love that question. So when I first came to Japan in 2009, I started at a research group with the hospital. And one of our first projects was looking at clinical research, not basic science research, but clinical research. And in 2009, China had actually just overtaken Japan by leaps and bounds in a single year in terms of producing clinical research. And China has just done a fantastic job in the last decade doing that type of clinical research. Now, it's pushed by having large numbers of patients, so you can do these very large studies. So that's one reason why we're seeing a lot of, good clinical studies coming out of China. Of course, the United States has had a long academic history of clinical research. That goes back 30, 40 years, pushed by some of the large academic centers on the East Coast and the West Coast. The question is, why is Japan in that 10th spot or even lower? One, there just isn't, even still, there isn't a huge emphasis on clinical research here in Japan. Funding, individual doctors' preferences tends to be getting into the lab and doing high quality bench science. So there's a kind of like an academic culture here that pushes people into the lab rather than onto their statistical software to process patient numbers. That's one thing. The other thing, and I don't want to be overly critical of Japan's healthcare infrastructure because, as we noted, they've done a very, very good job over the last 2 years. But that being said, the whole pandemic has uncovered a lot of small flaws, some large flaws, in terms of academic epidemiology here in this country. And by academic epidemiology, I really mean the field work necessary to surveil diseases, to catch them early, and then to build policy around what you've surveilled through that field work. That infrastructure, really, it just wasn't here in Japan at the start of the epidemic. There was no really robust CDC-like fieldwork mechanism or surveillance mechanism here in Japan. Names of institutions aside, that systemically that mechanism wasn't here. And if you don't have that mechanism in place, you can't produce the good clinical research needed in a pandemic situation.
Interesting. Any comment?
I mean, I had a sort of follow-up question to Dr. Deshpande, who's got more experience with this than myself. But I understand that sort of reluctance to sort of share data and collaborate between higher centers is also a factor for clinical research in Japan.
Yeah.
I don't know if you found that to be the case, that it's more difficult to sort of collect patient data across multiple centers, which you need to do to sort of publish large and meaningful studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And that stovepiping is, it's part of the culture of medicine here in Japan. Not only Japan, some other highly specialized countries. And it is a little bit of a hindrance and a barrier to producing really large, meaningful clinical studies.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Yes, Rocky, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Rocky Swift with Reuters again. There's dozens of kind of next generation vaccines that are being developed and tested around the world, some of them by Japanese companies and makers. Do you have your eyes on any of those vaccines that, probably won't be here in time for boosters, but maybe in the next year or two if COVID ends up being a kind of chronic phenomenon? Thank you.
Well, I had my eye on Novavax for a long time. So as opposed to an mRNA vaccine, Novavax, they basically build the spike proteins on a petri dish in a lab. Then they synthesize this lipid nanotube. And they, like cloves on an orange, they basically just stick the spike proteins onto this little nanotube and inject that into the body. So there's no mRNA involved. There's no human machinery involved. And that has a lot of potential. But unfortunately, they were late to the game, and the bar had already been set so high with the effectiveness of the mRNA vaccines that I was surprised that Novavax just never really got that foothold in place.
I mean, I haven't seen anything that looks like it's going to top the mRNA vaccines, actually. So I think the more interesting question is, what are the applications of that technology to other diseases that we've been struggling to produce effective vaccines for many, many years? So will we see an mRNA vaccine for malaria, for tuberculosis, for any one of for hepatitis C? I don't know. Is that technology applicable to a lot of other areas where we're still struggling?
Yeah, there's a lot of money in a potential mRNA vaccine for the common cold.
Can't see any questions. I'd like to just clarify a point, if I may, and that is, in Europe, where the situation is pretty grim at the moment, there's this problem of a pushback against vaccination. Now, you've indicated, I think, that that's not going to happen in Japan, that a sufficient number of people in Japan have accepted vaccination so that we won't have that problem. Is that the case, in fact?
Tom, you want to?
I mean, we've done a great job, and we're at the sweet spot where, so like 80% of the population have been vaccinated. Most of those have had 2 doses. And that, you're going to bear in mind that 10% of the population are ineligible because they're under 12. So this is kind of as good as it's going to get, in that, as we saw from Dr. Deshpande's slides, immunity is already starting to wane in the people who are vaccinated in the first half of this year. So will people continue to come in and get their boosters? Maybe not 80%. I mean, I speak to people in my clinical practice who had fairly stiff reactions to the Moderna vaccine commonly. And I guess that now, with the numbers being so low, some of them just won't see the need for a booster. So I wonder if we'll see some, dropping off of herd immunity because people won't all take the boosters. And secondly, we'll see more COVID being imported with the inevitable liberalization of travel. So I'm pretty sure there'll be some resurgence of disease. I just don't think we'll see it on the same scale as has happened in Europe, because Japan's always had sort of COVID light compared to Europe. It's always run at about sort of 10, 15, 25% of the disease burden. And I think, if we see a 6th wave, it will be a sort of Japan-sized 6th wave.
Okay. Do you wish to add anything?
No, thank you.
Okay, one quick final question from me. It may seem a rather silly question in a way, but Dr. Lomax, you mentioned with the therapeutics, it's important to start taking them in time, as it were. Now, a lot of people, including myself, I think, are hesitant to go to the doctor for at least several days, until while you think you perhaps just have a bad cold. So what is the kind of critical point? I mean, what should we do? Should we, if we have cold-like symptoms or flu, how quickly do we need to seek medical advice in order for the therapeutics to be effective?
I think, as a clinician, if you have significant respiratory infection symptoms, maybe at the moment you should think about contacting your doctor on like day 2. I can't give a universal answer because it depends on so many factors. If you're like really very, very sick and you're high risk, then you should contact your doctor on day 1. If you have trivial symptoms that you feel might just be seasonal allergies, you could reasonably wait a little bit longer. But if you want a sort of just one-size-fits-all answer, day 2.
Day 2.
What do you think, Dr. Deshpande?
Yeah, I think the data that we have so far, kind of like individual differences aside, says more testing, more quick testing and more robust testing is better than less testing or no testing. So the more we get people to test, whether it's at the doctor's office or just going down to their Tomods and picking up a...
Yeah, get your
Yeah.
home test kit. Have a test kit at home and test yourself on day one.
I'm of the thinking, there's no such thing as too much testing. That being said, the data also says that your highest yield for a true positive test is between, somewhere between day 3 and 5. And again, I'm talking about averages when we look at, studies of 1 million people. So test often,
Yeah.
test
yeah.
early, but not
Yeah.
too early.
Test early, and if you're still sick, test again.
Yeah.
Basically. Don't rely on one negative test if you're still unwell.
Okay, well, I think we're...
One more question, maybe.
Oh, one more question. Make it quick then, Kurt, because we're
Sorry.
pretty close to...
The wire.
Well, I'm strongly connected with Switzerland and Austria. I'm Swiss, actually. Just two things which came up today. Number one is that Switzerland has got above 50 per 100,000 yesterday. That's number one. Number two, Austria. They have made a total lockdown for everybody who is not got their vaccine. But my question is totally different. What does smoking have to do, particularly if you think about the ventilation, the lung, which is very strongly involved in the whole process. What are there any ideas or about the difference for people smoking and not smoking? Thank you.
Right, who'd like to take that one?
Well, smoking kills cilia. Smoking kills those little hair cells that are always brushing viruses and allergens out of our mucosa, out of our lungs, out of our trachea, out of our sinuses. You smoke, over time it kills off those cilia. Without the cilia, the viruses can just kind of get in there. They can sit in there a little more robustly, and you have a higher risk of getting really all kinds of infections.
I haven't seen any data that suggests that young, healthy smokers are at more risk. But obviously, if you have a smoking-related chronic disease, like if you have emphysema, chronic obstructive airway disease, or cardiovascular disease as a consequence of smoking, you definitely are at higher risk of severe disease or death from COVID. But I think we shouldn't understate it in younger people unless we got some data to back that up. But
yeah, it takes a while for those cilia to die off.
Yeah.
So younger people are clearly at less risk than older people.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when the pandemic kicked off in China, myself and one of my colleagues said, oh, well, they all smoke, so that's why they're all getting so sick. So when COVID comes here, we'll be fine. But we turned out to be completely wrong on that.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'll delay my first cigarette of the day. Okay, well, we are up against time now, so thank you very much indeed, Dr. Deshpande, Dr. Lomax. It's our custom here to give one-year honorary memberships of the club to our speaking guests. So, Dr. Deshpande, your one-year honorary membership.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Lomax, yours too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for your contributions. And please come back and see us again sometime.